I stared at him, the words escaping my mouth before I could stop them. I don't even need you. The silence that followed felt deafening, as if the entire room had frozen in time. His family, the people I had tried so hard to impress, stared at me with shock and disbelief. I felt their eyes burning into me, his mother's piercing gaze, his sister's thinly veiled disdain, and his father's cold indifference. It was all too much. They never accepted me, not truly. I was always the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit into their perfect little world. But today, I wasn't the one hiding my feelings anymore. His eyes widened for a moment, and for the briefest second, I thought he might say something, argue, fight for us. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor in an almost maddeningly deliberate motion. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. His eyes met mine briefly, and he simply nodded, like it was the most natural thing in the world. No words. No defense. He just nodded, stood up, and walked out of the room. Without me. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but it might as well have been a slam in my ears. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short bursts as I stood frozen in place. I could feel the heat of his family's stares on me, the weight of their judgment pressing down. This was my breaking point. For months, I had put up with their subtle insults, their whispers behind my back, the constant feeling of being lesser in their eyes. But today, it wasn't just about them. It was about him. And I was done. Did you really have to say that? His mother's voice cut through the silence, sharp and disapproving. She had always been the voice of reason in their family, or at least that's what she liked to think. She was the perfect picture of control, her every word calculated, every gesture prim and proper. And I hated her for it. I hated how she never saw me as enough, how she always made me feel like an intruder in their lives. I looked at her, my heart still racing, but now I felt a sense of relief. I don't know. Maybe I did. My voice was trembling, but it wasn't fear that made me shake. It was anger. It was the raw, unfiltered anger that had been building inside me for so long. The anger that had started with him and then seeped into everything around me. Into his family, into the way they treated me. I had been suffocating under the weight of their expectations. And now I was free. His sister, who had been silently watching the whole exchange, finally spoke up, her voice dripping with judgment. You think that's going to fix anything? You think he'll come back after that? I turned to her, my eyes narrowing. I don't care if he comes back. Maybe it's time I stop caring. The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth, but they were the truth. Deep down, I knew I had been waiting for him to change, for him to be the person I needed him to be. But he wasn't. He never was. And that truth, painful as it was, hit me like a slap in the face. I could feel the weight of his family's disapproval settling over me like a heavy blanket. They were disappointed, sure, but they were also relieved. Relieved that they could finally see me for who I truly was, someone who couldn't live up to their expectations. Someone who would never be good enough for their perfect little world. But in that moment, I realized something. I didn't need their approval. Not anymore. I turned and walked out of the room, my footsteps echoing through the silence that followed. The house felt cold now, empty in a way that it hadn't before. I hadn't realized how much I had been trying to force myself into a mold I would never fit. I had been pretending, for so long, that I could be the person they wanted me to be. But that wasn't who I was. And I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I reached the door, but before I could leave, I heard his voice from behind me. Wait. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I had said everything I needed to say, and I wasn't about to backtrack now. Don't go, he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. There was a desperation in it, a hint of something that I couldn't place. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to turn around, to give in. But I couldn't. I had already made up my mind. I'm not going to stay where I'm not wanted. Not anymore. I heard him move toward me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I might give in. And I wasn't ready to do that. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the cold air outside feeling like a welcome relief. As I walked away from the house, I could hear him calling my name behind me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't even need him. As the car door slammed shut behind me, I knew that there was no going back. The silence in the car was deafening, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't trapped anymore. But as the car pulled away from the house, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really made the right choice? Or had I just burned the last bridge I had left? It's been days since I last saw him, but the memory lingers like a bitter taste I can't shake. The silence that followed his exit was worse than anything I could have imagined. I thought I'd feel relief, that my chest would loosen, but instead, it's a hollow feeling that occupies the space where my heart used to be. I haven't heard from him, no call, no message. It's as if he's disappeared completely. And that, somehow, is even worse than the confrontation itself. The absence of any attempt to reach out eats at me. I sit in my apartment, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The silence here is different, though. It's not suffocating. It's mine. The kind of quiet that allows me to think, to question everything, and to feel something I didn't know I had been missing, freedom. But that freedom comes at a price. I pick up my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen for a moment, contemplating if I should reach out. Maybe I should apologize. Maybe I should admit that I overreacted. But then I remember his face, the look of indifference, the way he walked out without a word. He wasn't fighting for me. Why should I fight for him? I put the phone down and stand up, pacing around the room. The apartment feels empty, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional space he used to occupy. It's as if the walls themselves are waiting for something to fill the silence. I tell myself I'm fine. That I'm better off alone. But why does it still hurt? I try to distract myself, picking up a book from the shelf, but it does nothing to ease the ache inside. I can't focus. My thoughts keep drifting back to the night. His family's cold stares. The way they all looked at me, silently accusing. I can still hear his mother's voice, sharp and disapproving. Did you really have to say that? She'd asked, as if I was the one who had caused this mess. I had. I know that. But it felt like the only option at the time. I had been pushed too far. The phone buzzes on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glance at it, and my stomach drops. It's a message from his sister. The words are short, biting, as if she's been waiting for an excuse to lash out. You've made your choice. Don't bother trying to come back now. I stare at the message, the weight of her words settling over me. It's a statement, not a question. She's not looking for an explanation, just an opportunity to blame me for everything that went wrong. I can almost hear her condescending tone, the way she always spoke to me like I was inferior. I never measured up to her standards, and now it's all laid bare. She's won. I don't respond. There's nothing left to say. The next morning, I wake up to another message, this time from his mother. It's a voicemail, and as I listen to it, I can hear the restrained anger in her voice. I hope you're happy with your decision, she says, the words dripping with a passive-aggressive bitterness. You've thrown away everything for your pride. Don't think you can just walk away from this. I drop my phone on the couch, the weight of her words making my chest tighten. She's right, in a way. I did throw it all away. But the more I think about it, the clearer it becomes. What was I holding on to? A relationship that had never been mine? The facade of a life I didn't want? I reach for my phone again, but this time, I call my best friend. She answers on the second ring, her voice filled with concern. Hey, how are you holding up? I don't know, I say, sinking into the couch. I thought I'd feel better, but instead, it just feels worse. She's quiet for a moment, and then, do you regret it? I swallow hard, the question hanging in the air between us. I don't know. Maybe. But I don't think I can go back. Not now. Good. Because you deserve better than that. Her voice is firm, but there's warmth there too. You don't need to apologize for setting boundaries. You don't need to apologize for finally standing up for yourself. I close my eyes, her words washing over me like a bomb. I had been waiting for him to fight for me, to show me that he wanted this relationship. But he didn't. He never did. And now, with the space between us, I see it clearly. I had been fighting for something that wasn't real. As the day drags on, I find myself walking through the city, trying to clear my head. I pass by familiar places, cafes we used to visit, parks where we once spent hours talking. They all seem so distant now, like I'm looking at them through a fog. The memories that once felt comforting now only remind me of the emptiness I felt in his presence. He was never the person I wanted him to be, and I was never the person he needed. I stop at a cafe and sit down with a cup of coffee, the steam rising in front of me as I try to ground myself in the present. I take a sip, the bitter taste hitting my tongue, and for a moment, it's like I can breathe again. But then, as I sit there, I hear a familiar voice. It's him. I don't know how I know, but I do. I turn around, and there he is, standing in the doorway, looking lost. He hasn't changed. His expression is the same, the one he always wore when he was conflicted, unsure of what to say. But I'm not sure what to do with that look anymore. It doesn't move me like it used to. He steps toward me, and for a moment, the world seems to stop. His eyes search mine, as if trying to find a way back to what we had. But I know now that what we had was an illusion. I'm sorry, he says, his voice barely above a whisper. I feel the weight of those words hanging between us, but I can't bring myself to respond. I don't need apologies anymore. I don't need him. I'm sorry, he repeats, but it's too late. The silence between us is thick, and in it, I realize something I couldn't see before. I've already made my decision. I stand up, my hands shaking slightly as I grab my purse. It's over, I say, the words feeling final, but not as painful as I thought they would be. And as I walk away, I don't look back. The days after I left him felt like a foggy blur. I thought I'd be able to breathe easier, to find clarity in the absence of the constant tension that had hung between us for so long. But instead, there was an overwhelming sense of emptiness, a silence that settled deep into my bones. It was like I was trapped in my own mind, replaying everything that had led me to that moment over and over again. I kept telling myself it was the right choice. I had to do it. I had to walk away, even though it was the hardest thing I had ever done. But now, weeks later, I found myself questioning everything. Was I too hasty? Was I too harsh when I told him I didn't need him? What if I had been wrong all along? What if the love we once had could still be salvaged? I tried not to let those thoughts consume me, but they kept creeping in. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, the weight of what I had lost pressing down on me. In the dark, it felt like I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Other times, I would go about my day, and everything would feel fine, normal, even, until something small would remind me of him. A song, a scent, an old photo. I would feel the familiar ache in my chest, the pull to call him, to hear his voice, but then I would remember. He wasn't the person I needed him to be. He never had been. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I started to feel more like myself again. I started going out with friends, reclaiming parts of my life I had lost while I was with him. I took long walks, rediscovered hobbies, and spent more time doing things that made me happy. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Slowly, I was learning to live without him. One afternoon, a month after I left, I received a call. It was from his sister. I hadn't heard from her since the day I left, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I didn't want to go back to that place of discomfort, of walking on eggshells around his family, trying to fit into a life that wasn't mine. But I couldn't ignore her. She was family, after all, and I had loved her too, in my own way. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than I expected. "Can we talk?" I hesitated. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. "What about?" I just want to understand," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "Why did you leave him? He's been miserable without you. We all have." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't really thought about how his family would be affected by all of this. I knew they were disappointed, but I hadn't considered the weight it might carry for them. I had always been the one to hold everything together, the one who put on a brave face, even when I was falling apart. And now, here they were, reaching out to me, trying to understand why I had walked away. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I left because I had to. He didn't fight for me, and I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," she said quietly. "But maybe it wasn't just him. Maybe you both needed to fight a little harder." I felt the sting of her words, but I didn't let it show. "Maybe," I said softly. "But sometimes, you have to let go of something that isn't meant to be, even if it hurts." We talked for a while longer, but it was clear that neither of us was ready to bridge the gap that had grown between us. She was holding on to something I had already let go of. The conversation ended on a bittersweet note, and I hung up the phone with a strange sense of finality. I wasn't sure if I had made the right choice, but I knew I had made my choice. And I was done questioning it. The next few days passed without much change. I continued to focus on myself, on rebuilding the parts of my life that had been overshadowed by him. But then, one evening, as I was walking home from the grocery store, I saw him. I wasn't expecting it, wasn't prepared for it. He was standing on the sidewalk across the street, looking like he had been waiting for something. For me, maybe. His eyes met mine across the distance, and for a moment, everything stopped. The world around us faded away, and I was transported back to a time when I thought we were happy. When I thought we could make it work. He didn't move at first, and neither did I. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he crossed the street and stood in front of me. He looked different, older, maybe, or just more tired. There was a sadness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, and it made my heart ache in a way I wasn't expecting. "I've missed you," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. The words I had once wanted to say to him, the words I had hoped he would say to me, felt pointless now. I had already walked away, already made the decision to move on. There was no going back. I've missed you too, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. But I'm not the person you need. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching, as if he could find some sign that things could go back to how they were. But I knew better now. I had learned too much. I had learned that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes, walking away is the only choice left. He nodded slowly, as if accepting something he didn't want to accept. I know, he said quietly. I think I finally understand. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. And then, with one last lingering glance, he turned and walked away. I stood there for a while after he left, the city noises rushing back into my ears. It was over. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.